everybody, Miss Peachy again from WCA Biology, and today we are talking about Unit 4, Lesson 3. This is History of Classification. This is actually what I've noticed from this lesson is that there's a lot of repetition from your previous lesson. So if you remember, that last lesson was very long. As I was reading through this lesson, it felt like, and I think it's true, that there are sections that are exactly the same, and then they just add on to them. So as you're reading through, if you're having a little deja vu, that's probably why, because there actually is some redundancy in this lesson. I'm guessing they put it in there specifically because it's important and they wanted to remind you of what you had read previously. So there is not a slide to start with any kind of overview of vocabulary or key terms. It does talk a bit at the beginning, if you scroll to the bottom of this slide, about the objective of this particular page. And it says, in this section, you will explain how data supports current plant classification schemes. So again, we're talking about classification. We've talked about the Linnaean system of classification. In the previous lesson, we've talked about how domains were added like in the 1990s as kind of a higher level of classification. And our three domains are eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. We have those three domains. And then from there, the eukarya domain is subdivided into kingdoms. And then we kind of go into more narrower groups of classification from there. One of the kingdoms is plants. And so the first part here is talking about how plants are classified. It does mention that there are two main groups of plants that we have. Let's see. Okay, so we have actually, and this is probably, we have our two main groups. We have our vascular plants, and we have our non-vascular plants. Okay, so we have vascular plants and non-vascular plants. Vascular means that these plants have tissues within them that allow for the transportation of water and nutrients throughout the plant. They're vessels of a sort. Xylem and phloem is what the name of the tissue is. These are specialized tissues. This allows the plants generally to be larger because they can move material around their bodies and they can grow bigger. Non-vascular plants do not have this tissue. Therefore, those plants would rely on cell-to-cell transport like osmosis and diffusion and active transport to be able to move stuff from cell to cell because they don't have like a vascular network of tubes that allow for the flow of water and nutrients throughout their bodies. From the group of vascular and non-vascular, those vascular plants, let's see, so we talk about bryophytes here. Bryophytes is a main type of non-vascular plants. Mosses typically fall into that category of bryophyta. So these are small, they don't produce flowers, they lack roots and tend to grow in clumps. They are non-vascular, which means they lack that vascular tissue. They have simple tissues that perform those functions instead. It said, unlike mosses, ferns do not fall into that group of bryophyta. These are larger plants. They do have vascular tissue. They have some similarities to mosses because they don't produce seeds. Both mosses and ferns produce spores instead of seeds. So they have some similarities, but they're not the same. They don't belong in the same group. Then we can further kind of categorize all of our seed-bearing plants as either being gymnosperms or angiosperms. Gymnosperms are seed-bearing plants that do not produce flowers. Instead, they make cones. And angiosperms are flower-producing plants. And you can further subdivide those gymnosperms into different groups and the angiosperms into different groups as well. So here we have some kind of classification of plants. It also talks a little bit about a tree, the willow tree, and how the willow tree, you can kind of see this is a fossilized willow tree leaf, that today poplar is a genus of trees that includes many different types of willow trees. But more recently, we've been able to use DNA to help us categorize and classify plants. DNA contains genes which influence the traits the plants have. Plants in the same classification share more genetic similarities than plants in different classifications because plants within the same classification have a more recent common ancestor. When we look at the genome of our plants, we compare shared gene sequences, the G's, C's, T's, and A's, and we look at how many of them they have in common. And so this DNA code helps scientists define genetic relationships that maybe are hard to see just by comparing plants when they look, you look at the plants and see how kind of those shared characteristics, but the DNA really gives us more evidence to help us to kind of get beyond the scope of just what we can see. All right, so going on to kind of our next section here. Now we're going back to talking more about those dichotomous keys. Remember we mentioned that in the previous lesson as well. The dichotomous key is a way that we can kind of create a classification key to help people who may not know what the classification is of a specific organism is. You can actually buy whole books that are dichotomous keys. You can take them out with you into the field and you can use them if you were looking for plants that you don't know what the plant identification is. You can use the dichotomous key to help you to figure out what the identity of this unknown species is, right? So here's just a short example of one dichotomous key for trees. So do we have needles or do we have a broad leaf? If we have needles, we follow the questions on the left. If it's a broadleaf, we follow the questions on the right. So let's do this second picture here. So needles or broadleaf? This is a broadleaf. Is it a single leaf or it is a compound leaf? This would be a single leaf. This is an example of a compound leaf here. So we follow single. Does it have round or edges or jagged edges? Okay, well, it is smooth. So we say it comes from the oak tree. This is a highly simplified dichotomous key because in reality, you would need a lot more different steps to be able to ID your oak leaf. But for this example, kind of a simplified version of your dichotomous key, this would be your oak leaf right here. This is a white oak, I believe. All right. So kind of, giving you a better example of how to use a dichotomous key. And again, we'll practice that more in live lesson. So then moving on to the next section. Now we're getting some key terms. We have common ancestor, we have dichotomous key, we have eukaryotic, we have phylogenic tree, prokaryotic, and taxonomy. So really the only new term here is phylogenic tree. So it gives us the example of if I want to find where do I put this in the kitchen. There's some categories that you're going to go through in your brain before you even try to put the spoon away. You certainly aren't just going to open the refrigerator and put it in there because you know that you don't put utensils in the fridge. You probably won't open like an upper cupboard and throw your spoon in there because generally they don't go in there either. Maybe you'll think first, well, probably a drawer. So then you'll start looking at the drawers and you'll say, okay, is it going to be a small drawer or a large drawer? And there's different categories, but internally we put things in compartments, right? Even in our houses, there's a place where this is supposed to go, and that's where you put your spoons, right? So we do that in the living world as well. Just our kind of natural predisposition to categorization. So again, it talks about, this is where I'm talking about there's a lot of redundancy. So it's going to go back and talk about Linnaeus and the Linnaean system of classification, binomial nomenclature. This is, I think, the same exact information that was found in the previous lesson. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this. The humpback whale versus the basking shark. Again, I think it's just the same slide here. And then it's comparing, again, humpback whale to basking shark. So I'm going to skip this slide too. Oh, I don't want to skip it because now it brings up this picture. And this is what's known as a phylogenic tree. So what a phylogenetic tree does is it kind of is marrying the whole dichotomous key with the whole classification system. So now we start with our common ancestor. That's the trunk of the tree. And from there, we branch out into two. And then so the first kind of branch point is the first um, time that we see two different species. Every armpit, if you will, is a shared common ancestor. So here we have the lesser apes and the great apes. And the great apes gave rise to subfamily Ponginae and subfamily Hominae. And now we have three branch points. So we don't always necessarily have to have two for every one of these. So every branch point represents a common ancestor. And then we have our modern groups up at the top. Okay. So this is what's known as a phylogenetic tree. It's literally showing the oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top, with every branch point representing a common ancestor. So in the previous lesson, we talked a little bit about the study of cladistics and how you looked at derived characteristics and how that would help you to determine shared ancestry. The difference between a phylogenetic tree and a clade or like a cladistic tree is that you don't see derived characteristics on here. You're just seeing common ancestors. So in no way is it going to show you, for example, forward-facing eyes or something like that would be true for humans and for chimpanzees and things like that. There's no like traits that are shown actually on the tree. So it's different. We're going to see kind of two different ways in which we can use these types of trees. Phylogenetic trees just show the organisms historically, oldest at bottom, most recent at top, no derived characteristics, okay? And that's pretty much it. I think that was pretty much it for this unit, or this lesson, I should say. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff that is just reiterating some of the same stuff we've already talked about already. These slides are also repeating from the previous lesson. So that's all the new stuff for this lesson anyway. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, guys, I will see you in the next lesson. Have a great day.